Hello and welcome to the Eastern Front. My name is Yulia Joja. I'm with the Middle East Institute, Georgetown and George Washington Universities, and joined by my colleagues.
Giselle Donnelly, I work at the American Enterprise Institute, and
Dalit Borohash, also with AI.
On our podcast, we talk about the many challenges to European peace that tend to emerge along a line running from the Baltic to the Black Sea, the Eastern Front, and about why those matter to the United States. If you enjoy this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us. And today we are joined after one or two unsuccessful attempts, but finally thrilled to be joined by Alexander Lukashuk, who is currently a Reagan Fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy and the former head of the Belarus service of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Alexander, it's great to have you join us today. Welcome.
Thank you, Julia. It's an honor to be here.
There's many things that we need to talk about, and though we were planning this episode for a bit, the events surrounding Belarus right now are not avoiding us in any way. There's a lot to talk about, and it's really hard to keep track. One day, a couple of weeks ago, just after the formal mutiny, Lukashenko has been saying, the dictator of Belarus has been saying that Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, is in Belarus, then wasn't in Belarus anymore. We think he's been saying that there's nuclear weapons, Russian nuclear weapons deployed in Belarus, and we're preparing for the Vilnius summit of NATO with an extra 1,000 troops in and around Vilnius, supposed to be protecting NATO leaders that are apparently afraid of what can come out of Belarus, including Wagner. So perhaps we can start with that. Alex, to what extent is it a surprise that we are in this context right now in which Belarus and the relationship between Lukashenko and the Wagner group becomes such a menace to a NATO summit?
Yes, the NATO summit, which is probably one of the most important, or at least expectations for it, it's very high events, which is going to happen this summer, is a little bit upstaged by what's happening with Wagner and with Russia and with Lukashenko. I think the most important thing is that the day when we talk, Yulia, it became known that Lukashenko, in fact, was playing a role of a sparring partner of Kremlin, just fulfilling the request, not probably even of Putin himself. It turned out that Putin met with Prigozhin 5 days after the mutiny. And according to the sources of the French newspaper Libération, there was even a follow-up meeting on the 1st of July. So all these months of kind of a fog, who is where, why is Prigozhin in Belarus, and if so, why his train, I looked at the numbers, it traveled to Moscow since allegedly it was in Minsk 5 times, to St. Petersburg 4 times, to Rostov 4 times, and nobody saw Prigozhin, but he was quite okay. He was in Kremlin, he was seeing Putin as a part of a bigger group, 35 people, different generals, and a smaller group, allegedly only with the FSB people, state security services, and Russian guards. So this dynamics kind of puts aside the idea of mutiny as an immediate political threat. And that's one of the major points where we find ourselves today on the eve of the NATO. As far as we can say, that may not be quite a surprise information for the people responsible for the security of the summit in Vilnius. We know that the communications between Minsk and Moscow were monitored by the Western intelligence services, and it was kind of unintentionally, I believe, publicized.
Alex, this is like such a crazy set of events over the last several weeks. And Lukashenko, his role, can be interpreted almost any way you wish. I'd really like to hear sort of what your take is on this, and sort of what are we to make of this. I mean, you mentioned him as sort of a tag team partner for Putin, but it could be just as easily the case that he was kind of uninformed, if not innocent, bystander who just got yanked into the role of. I don't even know if he did any actual mediation, but he just sort of became the framework for all these negotiations. And every time we learn a little bit more about the story, it's like the prototypical case where you turn on the kitchen lights in the middle of the night and all the cockroaches go scuttling to their corners and to their holes. So I've never been a criminologist, and I have no intention of ever becoming one. But if you could sort this out, just tell us what your understanding is of the events of the affair Prigozhin.
Let me state maybe one quite obvious framework. The system which Putin has built, as well as Lukashenko, was based on loyalty. Loyalty is the most important category there. But when you have a war, when you start such a huge operation as war, loyalty is not enough. You need effectiveness. And loyalty and effectiveness, they kind of contradict each other. They don't coincide. That was the dilemma which Putin and Lukashenko face in many spheres, in economy, in international relations. Loyalty and effectiveness are not the same, but they always prefer loyalty. So the whole mutiny thing which happened, I think the first Putin's prime minister, Mikhail Kasyanov, was very blunt at the very beginning. He said this is a private conflict between Putin and Prigozhin. It was a little bit surprised. It's kind of because in a totalitarian kind of state, you don't have private initiatives. Everything is political, even sports is political, of course. But he insisted it is private, and I couldn't understand his logics. But he said, you see, it's kind of a criminal framework. You promise something, in this case, ammunition, shells, support, and you haven't delivered. And it's not about the law. It's not about some manuals. It's about the promises. And this promise in criminal mind are sacred. And that is what that was the conflict about. And they couldn't talk directly because it will kind of denigrate both players. So they need somebody who could do talking for them. It's all anybody who follows the criminal, I wouldn't call it establishment, but rules, knows that that's how it happens, at least in Russia. They talk with the help of intermediaries, and only then, after everything is settled, they kind of find a solution. So Kasyanov was quite straight in this. He said, what we're seeing is a deal being developed. Now, coming back to Lukashenko. Lukashenko's got some gains, of course, in this situation. All of a sudden, he became a peacemaker. If you looked at the Belarus TV mass media coverage of what happened after the first day of Prigozhin's march, you would see that he was called basically a savior of Russia, from civil war, of a savior of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of lives. But that's how Belarusian media presented him. In Russian media, it was much more muted. His role was much more narrow. They spoke about him, but it was always underlined that it was on the request of President Putin, that he did Putin's bidding. It was always kind of that it was not his initiative. So there were two different narratives. And these narratives kind of reached, interestingly, to Ukraine. Ukraine Secretary of the National Council for Security and Defense, Alexei Danilov, even said that Lukashenko maybe in the future can take some role play in the peace talks. So at some point, his role of a peacemaker of 2014 was remembered. So Lukashenko created for himself a little bit of space, a little bit an image of independent player. This is a very dangerous role when you are close to Putin. So he basically tried to play back very fast, saying no one is a hero here, neither me, no Prigozhin, no Putin, and he trying to tone it down very quickly.
Alex, it's such a fascinating framing that you give us of this being an instance of criminal deal making, and it makes appear Russia even much stranger that it had ever been sort of appearing to us. I want to just read to you a tweet from this morning from BBC's Steve Rosenberg, which I found endlessly entertaining, where he says the story so far: there was a mutiny, but it was over in a day. But Russian Air Force pilots were killed, but no one was arrested. But the Kremlin denounced the mutineers as traitors. But 5 days later, Prigozhin and Wagner commanders were in the Kremlin talking to Putin. All clear? End of quote. So just to sort of reiterate on that strangeness. I mean, like what like what the weirdness like of this tweet suggests, and what your framing suggests is that Russia, in fact, is not a state, right? It's not the sort of barbarian structure that has monopoly of coercive power over a certain territory, right? It's a sort of competing mafias with us on a territory that just happened to be right now in a sort of state of anarchic equilibrium of sorts, which may be very fragile. And I think we have to sort of brace ourselves for the prospect of this sort of equilibrium being sort of disturbed and going in a very sort of dangerous directions perhaps. But I wanted to ask you, and feel free to sort of push back on this or comment on that, but I would also wanted to ask you about the role of the Belarusian opposition in these current events. So we've all been very impressed by Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, whom we hosted at AEI some months ago, and by the sort of dedication of the United Belarusian Opposition to articulating an alternative to the regime and pushing for a sort of legal recognition of the opposition and preparing the groundwork for a democratic transition once this strange period of Belarusian history is over. But what do you think they are doing right now, what they should be doing, and how much leverage they can have at all over what's happening inside of Belarus, especially given the weirdness of the predicament that we are faced with?
Well, I think your remark about that Russia is not a state has so many fascinating topics coming from it, which affect, of course, international and internal situation and directly affect the future. But coming back to Belarus, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, I agree with you, has managed to run an extremely impressive operation. For all my 30 years with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, I've never seen an opposition. It's not even operation, kind of a cabinet being so effective and being so impressive. It just shows the talent which is there, and all of a sudden it just flourishes the moment you give it a little freedom, a little oxygen. In this particular case, you see, the problem is how do you react to a thing like that pseudo mutiny in Russia? It is, on the one hand, you have to react. It's a big thing. It's because you have to understand and to explain. Is it just a crack in the window? Is it a show? Or is it something serious? On the other hand, to give a reaction which is kind of a little bit longer than immediate reaction with some perspective. The mutiny should have been longer. You see, it was over too fast. It's almost impossible to react to something which was so fast in a meaningful long-term way. It's the work for analytics or observers, commentators, but not for the political force. She did react. Her people issued a statement saying that the Belarus should draw back, reject all the so-called union treaties which Belarus has with Russia, with the common defense, which is not a new idea, which has been repeated many times, but it was timely, and it was a correct reminder that the longer you stay dependent on Russia or kind of tied to Russia, of course, the more dangerous it is for Belarusian independence, to say nothing of the Belarusian internal situation. You see, we're talking here about Prigozhin, but what I think is more important to talk is about this situation of just Gestapo, what Belarus has turned into, with people being tortured, persecuted, denigrated, humiliated, and pressured, being changed, in fact, into something almost slaves, because even the freedom of movement is now being curtailed. And that is what's happening in Belarus, with almost all Western ambassadors having left the country. The level of diplomatic presentation is downgraded. Now Ukrainians also left. There is no ambassador. Germans left. So the level of Belarusian so-called sovereignty and independence is just there for grabs for Putin, depending what's going to happen with Ukraine. And what's interesting both ways, whether the conflict, the war with Ukraine ends the way Putin wants, or whether it ends in a different way, the danger for Belarus remains the same.
To make things just slightly more complicated, on the other hand, when we're looking at Lukashenko, and correct me if I'm wrong, at least a majority of analysts have been pointing to the fact that he is trying to survive in a way that entails some kind of independence or autonomy from Russia, because that's his only way of survival. And so I want to ask you to make sense for us of two current or recent events that seem, at least on the surface, as an attempt, but I'm wondering to what extent this attempt is successful, for Lukashenko to wiggle himself a little bit looser from the Kremlin, beyond the mediator role that he's trying to assume. And one is the conventional military side. Radio Free Europe and I think others have also been reporting on the fact that several camps, tent camps, that were used for training for thousands of Russian soldiers on Belarusian territory have been dismantled ever since the mutiny in a very fast manner. And we sort of expected the Wagner group to move to Belarus and do something, train there. And so the Belarusian authorities, with Lukashenko managing to close these conventional Russian forces training camps, isn't that an act or a small step towards a little bit more autonomy from the Kremlin? And the other thing is the nuclear weapons. And to me, that's the most complicated thing, because it seems to me that Lukashenko has been trying really hard for a while to get nuclear weapons. How does that grant him independence? And the last note here is the comment that I thought was worth reproducing that he made when asked somewhat recently about whether he can confirm that Belarus is now hosting Russian nuclear weapons on his territory. And he says, yes, Belarus is offering protection for these nuclear weapons.
Yulia, it's very murky situations in each of these questions, in each of these topics which you mentioned, and I believe it's murky on purpose. But let's do it step by step. First of all, what Lukashenko has, his main capital, his main most precious possession. He owns the state. In the today international system, if you have a state, it's much more important that you have $100 billion, or how many Elon Musk has, or whoever billionaires, because with the state you have in the perestroika there was under Gorbachev there was a joke, just give me 1 meter of the state border and I will build you a golden monument. He has a whole state, and that gives him in Europe of all places, the real estate is fantastic. In the sense of Europe, on the border with Russia and with the Western Europe is NATO, to have one's own state it's priceless. So that's as long as he has it, his value and his position is quite stable. I'm afraid. In terms of the camps, there's an alternative explanation. Russia has finally started building its own camps. They don't need Belarusians any longer. They are able to start training in there, because that was the capacity issue in the beginning of the war. Wagner, role of Wagner fighters in Belarus was touched upon by Lukashenko in a couple of ways, saying that maybe 5,000, 8,000 of them, or maybe just a couple of hundreds who will train Belarusian. But looks like it's more. But he always also said that basically it depends on Wagner what they want to do. So he was well aware of what was going on about meetings of Prigozhin and Putin, and that if they needed his help as a state to give some legal framework, as they use the word, to issue them passports or logistics to fly all over the world to Asian or African countries where Wagner was operating, yes, he could provide that. That was not a big issue. But looks like the Wagner Group would not need it. Whatever stays of it in the field, they could do it from the Russian territory. Now the nuclear weapons. The nuclear weapons is interestingly an issue and a non-issue at the same time. You see, when asked directly about that by the group of foreign journalists a week ago, he staged a rare press conference for them. He said, well, why? Other European Ukrainians are using foreign weapons supplied by other countries in there. So we can use also, we can have, why cannot we have nuclear weapons? It's a logic which is kind of okay as long as you don't use the word nuclear. But speaking in terms of context, since 2009, I believe 5 European non-nuclear countries have nuclear weapons on their territory. Belgium, Netherlands, I believe Spain, Italy, and Germany. It's operated or owned by the United States, but it is placed there. It's so-called tactical weapon. Moving nuclear weapons to Belarus in terms of military goals or objectives or defense needs doesn't change absolutely nothing, neither for Belarus nor for Russia. Russia has already moved its nuclear weapons to Kaliningrad, or Krolowets, as now Poland calls it. It's a tactical weapons, and in terms of distance, they can reach the same goals as from Belarus, so nothing changes in these works. So what is left is something different, is an attempt to influence, I believe, Western public opinion and to influence Western politicians. There was an interesting episode, I think last month. There was a declaration by Putin and Chinese leader Xi Jinping about nuclear weapons, that they should not be moved, they should stay. And then 3 days later, Putin said, yes, we are discussing moving nuclear weapons, agreeing with Lukashenko to move to Belarus. It was a very strange 2 statements in the space of 3 days. And there's only one explanation, that Putin wants his Chinese counterpart, that will be the rhetoric, but probably the weapons will not be moved. Or if they are moved, they will never be used, or Lukashenko will have no control over them. So China, which is also a part of this discussion about so-called nuclear weapons in Belarus, is a very interesting factor. During that time, Lukashenko also made unexpected trip to Beijing, where he spent, I think, 2 or 3 days. And that was the time when Beijing tried to propose their own so-called peace plan. But the first, of course, point is stop fighting, which was not acceptable at all and didn't go very far so far. So these are elements are all in play, but not in a militaristic way, not in a military way, but in a political, I would say, dimension.
Alex, I wonder if we could quiz you for a bit about your perhaps more scholarly work on the intersection of politics and history and these questions of historic memory in Central and Eastern Europe, and what you call the sort of democratic and totalitarian views of history and historic memory. Clearly, this is a part of the world that has a very difficult history, which is right now, it seems to me, slightly overshadowed by a little sort of Eastern European sense of kumbaya, driven by the fact that we all, fear Russia and dislike Putin's Russia and want to keep it at bay. But there are painful, difficult episodes from the past. And just to illustrate that, I was struck over this weekend by the images of Presidents Duda and Zelensky in the Western Ukrainian city of Lutsk, commemorating the Polish victims of Ukrainian nationalist massacres during the Second World War that killed tens of thousands and there is some debate about whether that episode constituted an act of genocide or not. But sort of seeing these two democratic leaders kind of, confronting this painful episode of their common history, to me was very striking, very different from how these questions tend to be approached in more autocratic environments by politicians. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how significant you see this particular episode in isolation, but also in the context of what might be other fracture points in the relations of these Eastern European nations, Belarusians, Poles, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, and do you see those perhaps tensions or painful episodes from the past being confronted in the coming years?
Actually, may I add a footnote to Dalibor's question? In addition to talking about historical memory, Dalibor, I noted that meaning as well. That's made me think that there was also a sense of historical imagination at work. So we're kind of at a moment where people are willing to look back, but the purpose is also to frame a future and to try to come to grips with the past, because there is an opportunity to create a different future. And certainly I think many in the West have sort of begun to understand Poland and Ukraine as being at that moment. But certainly from my point of view, thinking about Belarus in that way is equally important. If the Russian imperial exercise is to end, it well ought to include Belarus. So again, I'd ask Alex to both inform us of his work on historical memory, but also to try to translate it in a forward-looking way.
Of course, we all remember the famous Orwell's formula. Who controls the past controls the future, who controls the present controls the past. I thought quite intensely about this statement, saying, isn't there something wrong with it? Or what is it about actually? Does it still work 70 years after it was formulated? And the most frequent word in this formula is not past, is not present, is not future, it's control. 4 times he says controls, controls, controls. Controls, of course, is about power. So this is one of the formulas of political power. And in this respect, you can say there's nothing new, because its power has always been this multifaceted and was always about trying to prolong now. And autocracies always live in now. They don't have the past. Their past begins when they come to power. They all their predecessors are always wrong. So it's only now and going forward. You can, by the way, change the word who controls the present with internet. Who controls internet? He controls the past. He controls the future. It's a technology, a new game in the town, which is now, of course, happening on our Putin. When he looked for a reason, pretext to attack Ukraine, he used so-called historical facts. Published an article in Izvestia, as you remember, 2 years ago, and Russia tried to present it as the war for the true history, which was stolen by bad Ukrainians, by Nazis. In Belarus, last year, 2022, the most important thing for that year was all of a sudden history. On the first working day of 2022, Lukashenko signed a decree on the 3rd of January, declaring the year 2022 the year of historical memory. That the idea was we have to enhance this historical memory, to unite people, which was kind of a little bit unexpected, but understandable. Russia was amassing its troops on the border with Ukraine. Russian troops were in Belarus. So anything which could help national identity or remember who you are was helpful. But then 3 days later, he signed a law. And the law was called On the Genocide of the Belarusian People. All of a sudden, in 2022, a law was adopted which declared that from 1941 to 1951, during these 10 years, were years of the genocide of the Belarusian people. And the law punished any interpretation of the history of the Second World War or what's happened after that with up to 10 years in prison. It's so-called direct memory law, which prescribes how to view historical events and how to discuss them. What was interesting, of course, was that immediately there was a role of the Office of Prosecutor General in history. You cannot talk about history without the prosecutors. And a couple of months later, last June, the Prosecutor General of Belarus went on a book tour. He and his Office of the Prosecutor published a book which was called the same as the law on the genocide of the Belarusian people. And remember, the law said it is 1941, 1951. By the way, these authoritarian regimes always take liberty with dates. So the first almost 2 years of the World War One were kind of dismissed as they didn't exist, and then 7 more added. What was dismissed, of course, is Molotov-Ribbentrop Act, which is now a genius of diplomacy, things like that. But the book, he went on a book tour, and all of a sudden he said, this book also includes episodes from 2020, from the elections of 2020, from protests. The genocide of the Belarusian people, its concept now includes peaceful protests against rigged elections of 2020. And this Prosecutor General even said, what happened in 2020 was a direct result that we didn't teach our youth the history in a proper way. So if you need an example straight from the horse's mouth, that is the way these regimes looks at the history, as a very practical, very current political tool in power struggle, nothing more. This year, by the way, is also has a title. And what do you think a year when a nuclear weapon is being returned to Belarus, or the war criminal Prigozhin is being welcomed to Belarus? Of course, this year can have only one name, the Year of Peace. In Belarus, it's officially Year of Peace this year. Politics of memory is never about memory. It's always about power. And in this context, it's always about future. You, Dalibor, mentioned it's important to use correct, of course, terms and words when we describe about what are we in fact seeing on that territory now in Russia. Is it a state? What kind of state? But that mutiny, whatever you call it, I think shed light on the future, at least midterm future, of democracy in Russia. There will be no elections. There will be no civil society. The conflicts or power struggle between the regions, between elites, between different professional groups will not be resolved in any way of democratic manner. It will be resolved in the manner Prigozhin was resolving his conflict with the state. There will be a lot of this type of fighting, criminal agreements, disagreements, infights, but there will be no place for a democratic expression of power. I think that's the most important lesson or outcome of this Prigozhin's journey, which not a month even yet, but we already it already showed the future and challenges for possible democratic development of Russia and Belarus.
We have just maybe a couple more minutes time. And so I want to ask you to wrap up, because you gave us this almost philosophical overview of Lukashenko and the war. If for Lukashenko, looking at the region, 2022 was the year of historical memory, contextualized also with Putin's interpretation, as you eloquently pointed out, and 2023 is connected to the nuclear weapons and, in a very paradoxical way, peace. What about 2024? And I guess that's a twofold question. 2024 through the eyes of Lukashenko, that's a challenge in itself. But from your perspective too, we will be, I think for most analysts now, if not for all, it's pretty clear that the chances of the war ending this year are slim. And so when you're looking into 2024, is that marking for you a possible end of the war? And what will that make out of Belarus then?
I think Yulia a little bit touched on the 2024 because, of course, it's a year of so-called presidential elections in Russia. You see, Russia came up with this technology which they call in Russian обнуление, zeroing up or starting from zero when you cancel constitution and you start counting new presidential terms from the moment new constitution kicks in. That it's like Humpty Dumpty, when he says words mean whatever I want them to mean. Lewis got it exactly right. The Lukashenko. For Lukashenko, as well as for many, for Putin, but for Lukashenko, the main goal is survival. Survival, staying in power, and probably outlasting Putin, both politically and physically. That's I mentioned physically because both men are in their 70s. They didn't live the most healthy, didn't have the most healthy lifestyle during their years. And it's we already saw during the Brezhnev years and his successors how so-called gerontocracy in the authoritarian systems, it's not effective at all. And even to keep loyalties, you have to be effective in a way. But that's his main goal. There's no love lost between Lukashenko and Putin, but he will try to do everything, of course, to outlast him. There is still a slight opening for him in the so-called Union State. If Putin, for some reason, leaves that position, either because of natural causes or because of political causes, there's, of course, this so-called platform, which is called Union State, and there is a head of Union State. And Lukashenko tried it once during Yeltsin years to get an upper hand, but was pushed back. And but there is always this possibility. His soft power in Russia is quite impressive. In regions, in local newspapers, he's quite popular, and he keeps his support there on quite decent level. Not like Putin, but he's always probably the second most popular politician in Russia. Not only in Russia, I must say the same was in Ukraine. He was for many years after 2014 the most popular foreign politician in Ukraine. 2024 will be the year of elections, not only of course, in Russia. There will be already political campaigns in the United States, in other Western countries. So this will be a year when discussions in Vilnius, which are taking place these days, will have enormous historical, in fact, significance. The way the Vilnius summit of NATO plays out, the decisions which are announced and the decisions which are goals which will be stated there, they may have probably bigger significance than we thought even a month earlier or 2 months earlier. That's where the future of the region, the interests of democracy in Europe, and I wouldn't say in the United States to such an extent, but that's the place where to look and to listen and to pay attention to. Vilnius is becoming the capital of the future during the next couple of weeks.
Before we depart, Alex has made me even more nervous about the proceedings at Vilnius, super nervous about the even minuscule prospect that Lukashenko could emerge in 2024 as the new Tsar of the Russia-Belarus Union. And even more frightening that Lukashenko could get in a macho competition with Putin, because I don't want to see him with his shirt off under any circumstances. So I thought it was important to add a couple notes of absurdity to what was otherwise a quite profound podcast. Alex, I'm sorry for having a crazy imagination, but I appreciate your time. And now back to planet Earth.
Alexander Lukashuk, thank you so much for joining us today. From me, Yulia Zhozha, and my friends.
This is Al Donnelly and
thank you for listening to the Eastern Front. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us. To stay up to date with the Eastern Front, please give us a follow on Twitter at Eastern Front Pod in one word, and sign up for the newsletter through the link included in the show notes. You can find more episodes and additional content on our website, ai.org, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you and goodbye.